Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Jacob Mchangama, who is here to discuss and maybe even debate the validity of claims that X under Elon Musk is a true champion of free speech. Now, Elon Musk is obviously embroiled in free speech controversy over in Brazil as we speak, so this is a very timely topic. Make sure to subscribe here to the Undercurrents YouTube channel, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and over at undercurrents.tv for even longer versions of these interviews. Just yesterday, at an event in London, Meta executive Nick Clegg excoriated Elon Musk, his competitor, of course, describing Musk as, quote, a sort of one-man, sort of hyper-partisan and ideological hobby horse. Clegg sought to draw contrast between Meta and X. Quote, it's honestly not used by the vast majority of normal people around the world. Fact check on that one comes out true. Clegg continued to say of Musk's platform, people go to X to start yelling at each other about current affairs and politics. It's a tiny, elite, news-obsessed, politics-obsessed app. The vast majority of people join Facebook and Instagram for much more playful reasons. Today's guest agrees with maybe some of that and actually made a similar comparison between Meta and X just days ago. Quote, X is the bastion of free speech on the internet, Jacob wrote in Unheard this week. At least that's what Elon Musk and his raucous supporters would like you to believe anytime one dares to point out his hypocritical, arbitrary, and often self-serving content moderation actions after taking over the social media platform. Jacob argues that Mark Zuckerberg's Meta, which recently determined from the river to the sea, referring to Palestine, should not be flagged as hate speech. That puts Musk to shame to some extent because Musk has claimed that phrase and others are punishable calls to genocide, Jacob points out. It's worth noting also that Musk has suppressed speech at the request of foreign governments like India and the UAE in order for the platform to continue operating in those countries. So is Musk just the flip side of the speech policing coin? Anti-woke to the point of banning words like cisgender? Let's ask Jacob Mchangama, the executive director of the Future of Free Speech and a research professor at Vanderbilt University. Jacob, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, of course, Jacob is the director of the Future of Free Speech. He's also the author of Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media, and a professor at Vanderbilt University. So, Jacob, you're an expert in this space. I'm just going to start with a really basic question. Is Elon Musk a hypocrite when it comes to free speech?
The very short answer, yes. The longer answer is that I was actually hopefully optimistic when Musk announced that he would buy Twitter. So for quite a long time, the trajectory of big tech had been towards more and more restrictions on free speech, sort of veering away from the initial techno-optimistic promise of free speech that was the lifeblood of Silicon Valley. So I thought it would be great to have sort of a disruptor come in and sort of change course. The problem with free speech, of course, is that it's a very easy principle to be in favor of. In the abstract, it's much more difficult to be consistent and principled. And I think he has struggled a lot with being consistent and principled. But he has done some good things. So let's highlight those first. So I think it was good that he let back controversial people. You know, I think it was right to let Donald Trump, for instance, come back, you know, like him or loathe him. He is someone whose voice resonates with a lot of people and who's obviously a very important player in both in debates in America, but also globally, given the importance of America. I also think that he's right to push back against the authoritarian tendencies of judges in Brazil. I think he's right to be critical of the European Union's attempts to sort of be the global cyber sheriff of social media. You can debate his tactics. I don't necessarily think that, you know, memes and shit posting is the best strategy, but I think it's the right impulses. But then again, you know, when it comes to other countries, you see a very different Elon Musk. So let's take Turkey. You know, Turkey is a country which is quite authoritarian, run by President Erdogan, who's certainly not a friend of free speech. And so shortly before the last election, the Turkish government asked X to remove accounts of prominent members of the opposition, and they complied. Just before an election where Erdogan actually might have lost. And Elon Musk sort of defends his decision, saying, you know, I had the choice between throttling a few accounts or shutting down all of X throughout the whole country. There was no real pushback. There was no labeling Erdogan like a dictator. And, when it comes to Brazil, he's said, I'm not going to shut down a few accounts. I'd rather all of X is being shut down. Then another example is India. India is a huge country, more than 1 billion people, but it's also a country which is becoming more and more censorial under its Prime Minister Modi, and Modi has demanded that a lot of content be removed. X has complied with several of these requests. I have not seen Elon Musk call Modi a dictator, making memes of him. In fact, when Modi reached 100 million followers on X recently, Musk posted, a congratulatory post on X saying, "Congratulations on being the most followed leader in the world."
That's interesting, actually, because it's such a direct contrast. The reporting in India, the reporting in Brazil. And actually, Jacob, if you could give us a little bit more on Brazil, because I know you've been following this closely. Exactly what is Elon Musk defending in Brazil? And then maybe help us contrast with, you were just doing this, but even more, what he could have done in case studies with Turkey, India, UAE, Pakistan, other countries.
Yeah, so this is, of course, one of these issues where it's difficult for tech companies. I could actually understand if someone like Musk said, okay, we're going to fight it all the way. We're going to loudly, vocally, publicly try and resist these orders, these takedown orders from governments. But once, a court has made a decision, we're going to follow it because otherwise we'll be shut down. I can sort of understand the rationale behind that, especially if you have transparency on the side of the platform saying, we received this order from this government. They want us to take this content. We disagree because it doesn't violate our terms of service and it's protected under international human rights norms for free speech, for instance. And we think it undermines our mission. But if you're going to fight back, why wouldn't you do it in a consistent manner? And Brazil is a case where I really think it's important to fight back. So since 2019, the Brazilian judiciary has basically given itself powers to police disinformation in cyberspace. And it's important to remember that this was a development that started well before Musk even acquired X. So it has affected not only X, but lots of others. And I think that is a really dangerous development in Latin America's largest democracy. I think it's quite damning for Brazil to have now blocked X when you think about the fact that Venezuela, an outright authoritarian state, also in August, the same month where Brazil blocked X, banned X on the basis that it was spreading hate speech and fascism. And the transparent reason why Venezuela did so was because Maduro, the president there, had just stolen an election. So that does not reflect well on Brazil. It shows something which I think is Musk is right to point out, that governments around the world, including democracies, have become increasingly censorial. There's this elite panic going around the world where governments are trying to impose some type of top-down control of cyberspace. And that should be fought vigorously. But, Turkey and India strike me as pretty good places to take up that fight as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then it, for me at least, as I'm thinking of this, brings me to the question of, is he a net benefit or a net disadvantage for the sort of global cause of free speech, like in the aggregate, when we evaluate Elon Musk at this point? Do you have thoughts on that?
Under the Digital Services Act in the European Union, you're obliged to sort of give a transparency report, and X has filed one. It's quite short, but on its own website, they have not sort of published these more detailed enforcement reports since, I think, July 2022. So it's quite easy for Elon Musk to say, hey, we're doing all this great things about free speech. But when you don't have any transparency, when you actually try to limit researcher access to the platform, to the data, it's quite difficult for us to say, well, has he been a net benefit or not? What we can say is that he's certainly not been consistent on content moderation. Of course, Elon Musk has the powers, the right to set his own rules for his platforms. But the whole idea behind taking over X was that he was going to allow a lot more speech than other platforms. It was not merely, fighting back against governments. It was fighting back against this trajectory of big tech being much more intolerant of controversial speech, whether on COVID, on misinformation, on expanding categories of hate speech, and so on. And as I said, he's let back Musk, he's let back, controversial people, especially from the right, people who could justifiably say, well, that they were targeted. But it seems that he has also instead weaponized his content moderation decisions against sort of the progressive woke left that he's declared war on. And so that to me is not a net benefit. If you allow people in from the right, sort of extreme voices or controversial voices from the right, only then to turn on people on the left, then that's just partisanship. And so what's a good example of that is, for instance, he has said that the phrase "from the river to the sea" that you see pro-Palestinian activists all over the world repeat constantly, that constitutes genocide and will be banned from his platform. Now, that phrase is not only, completely protected by the First Amendment, which Elon Musk claims to be a fan of, but is also protected speech on Meta platforms. In fact, the Oversight Board a couple of weeks ago upheld the decision to allow "from the river to the sea." Another example is the use of the terms cis and cisgender. These are terms that are sometimes used in a derogatory manner by sort of trans activists, the LGBT community. And Elon Musk has said those are now considered slurs on X. And we've seen some examples where, at the very least, these terms have been sort of labeled with a warning that they constitute harmful speech under X's terms of service. It seems like Musk is sort of catering to the very online right and their free speech grievances, but weaponizing content moderations against the woke left. And that may be great for engagement, but it actually undermines sort of the old school civil libertarian principles of free speech that I think are necessary for free speech to thrive.
Right, where Musk departed from the decision Meta made, as you just pointed out, is he said "from the river to the sea" constitutes, as you mentioned, incitement to genocide. So it is therefore not protected speech on X. And that's interesting because it brings me to why people still see Elon Musk as a champion of free speech. And I'm wondering, Jacob, I assume you have thoughts on this because you've written so much about it. Does that tell us something about what we think of as free speech, about our personal definitions of free speech, that so many people look at Elon Musk and say, it's okay, it's reasonable for somebody who's in favor of free speech to ban incitement to genocide. It doesn't make them less of a champion to free speech. So does that tell us maybe something about, how we conceive of free speech as a culture?
Yeah, I think it does. It's this concept that I call Milton's curse. So I base it on the famous English poet called John Milton, who wrote the Areopagitica, this famous call for free speech in 1644. Now, it's a very eloquent treatise, against censorship. But when you read it more closely, you find out that John Milton actually is not in favor of free speech for Catholics, not for people, who are sort of too radical Protestants. In fact, he's mostly in favor of free speech for mainline Protestant sects. And that is a pattern that we see again and again throughout the history of free speech, including today, that when you ask people in the abstract, are you in favor of free speech? Definitely. Everyone's in favor of free speech. But then when you ask about specifics, people are divided along tribalist or ideological line. If you ask people who lean Democrat, for instance, they are much more likely to say that mis and disinformation should be banned. But if you ask people on the right, they will say burning the American flag should be banned. Donald Trump himself, has repeatedly said that, people should go to prison for 1 year, even though the Supreme Court has decided that flag burning is protected by the First Amendment. So most people are not consistent on free speech. Like I said, it's a very difficult principle to uphold. And so we use it for partisan purposes. And so when you have a very polarized public sphere, and then when you have a platform like X, which incentivizes polarization and tribalism, free speech wars become much less about principle and much more about sort of creating a grievance-fueled narrative about, why you're the persecuted victim of the evil forces on the other side. And then when the other side is affected by free speech decisions, it's perfectly reasonable.
And "From the River to the Sea" is such a great example of this because it sort of pitted the left's concept of free speech for the first time. I mean, we saw this a lot on the right, but on the left, we saw this sort of come to a head because elite consensus is genuinely divided on that issue. And you have the people who are, I don't know, you're sort of tempted to use these new tools that technology allows to suppress different types of speech, turn the volume up, turn the volume down. And they had to grapple with what that means. And Elon Musk, as someone who is a free speech champion, sort of from the center, as he would put it, came down on a different side than Facebook or Meta did. And actually, Nick Clegg said, I criticized Elon Musk just yesterday for saying that Andrew Tate and Tommy Robinson were, quote, running amok on the platform, and that, you know, it's sort of a platform just for elites. And I kind of wonder, is there capitalist competition over free speech, grappling with who can, you know, shoehorn their position into the true free speech position to undermine the other platform? What's going on just on a business level?
On a business level, I think it's very difficult to have a platform that you want to be economically viable based on maximalist free speech principles. Because at least if you're based on an advertising model, you know, Disney and Coca-Cola and all these other companies, their mission is not to advance free speech. Their mission is to, you know, maximize revenue and satisfy their shareholders. You know, you might say people don't like Tommy Robinson, but I think it's important that, you know, even voices like Tommy Robinson should be on the platform. Then Coca-Cola comes and say, well, we're not going to spend dollars on your platform. And they have every right to do so, you know, in my opinion. And that, I think, also explains why this trajectory that we've seen, that Silicon Valley social media companies have moved from sort of being the free speech wing of the free speech party, which was sort of what Twitter called itself in the early optimistic days, and sort of have learned that, you know, if you want you know, to maximize revenue, then it's very difficult to be free speech absolutist, or not even free speech absolutist, but even sort of champion speech that is lawful in many countries, but which is just deemed beyond the pale by stakeholders, by activists, and it's impossible to keep them all satisfied. And which is why I think, you know, you might remember, you know, Mark Zuckerberg tried in 2018 to give this talk at Georgetown, where he sort of said, you know, it's important to stand up for free speech. We're even going to allow, you know, Holocaust denial, and that he was met with outrage and had to reverse his decision. I don't think that, you know, making lots of money on social media as a platform is necessarily something that goes hand in hand with free speech maximalism.
And Zuckerberg also recently talked about how he regretted, that's the word he used, regretted complying with government pressure. You know, he said it was Meta's decision to suppress the Hunter Biden laptop stories and some stuff about COVID, and that he, quote, regretted it. Do you see him as someone who is he was talking about it on Joe Rogan fairly openly. Is he someone who is sincerely thinking through these issues? Is he someone this is fully through the prism of his business decision at any given moment? The public starts turning against censorship. He comes out once again against censorship. How does he fit into this?
It's very difficult to know what are his true motivations. I would imagine someone who has worked as hard to create as successful a business like Mark Zuckerberg, I would be very surprised if his first commitment was not to Meta rather than the principle of free speech. I think that would be the case for most people in his position. Whether this was just sort of sensing where the winds blow in DC, I don't know. But I think it highlighted something important. And I think, you know, if the right lessons to be learned from this, it would be that these companies are transparent about when governments demand or ask or nudge them in the direction of removing content. That would be sort of walking the walk, and also pushing back, especially, you know, the U.S. government, given that the U.S. is unique among democracies in the amount of speech protection that it offers under the First Amendment. Meta did not have to sort of cave in. They could have stood their ground. And so it'll be interesting to see, you know, next time something happens. You know, you could very well imagine that after the election, something happens where different narratives, different versions of truth are playing out very prominently on social media. What will the reaction be of these platforms.
And a lot of free speech advocates, including people like Nadine Strawson, will wax nostalgic for a time when groups like the American Civil Liberties Union used to be more consistent on these principles. And I know that they would extend that to defenders on the right as well. But there has been something really interesting that's transpired where even people who work at the ACLU are now really tempted by these new censorship tools. And it's morphed into sort of shifting their ideological focus. And Jacob, you've written a book about social media or about censorship from Socrates to social media. And I guess I'm curious just for your take on how these tools might be giving people more reason to believe in ideologies about censorship that have probably always been with us, nothing new under the sun.
In the US, a lot of sort of groups that are leaning more liberal, progressive, have come to to sort of internalize the idea that the values of free speech and equality are at tension, whereas it used to be the case that these values were seen as mutually reinforcing. So, if you read someone like Frederick Douglass or, the civil rights movement, ACLU, Skokie advocacy, that was sort of the idea, minorities are never safe when you allow the government to restrict speech, because those restrictions will always be defined and enforced by majorities, and those who suffer will be minorities. And therefore, we have to be principle hard-nosed. We have to stand up for Nazis to march through the town of Skokie, Illinois, even though a large number of Holocaust survivors inhabit that town. I wouldn't say it has been completely abandoned. I think, ACLU still brings an important case. I think they recently defended the NRA in an important First Amendment case, but it's certainly the case that they're not, they're also advocating other ideas where they sort of suggest that social justice, racial justice is at odds with free speech.
Speech can be violence, can be tantamount to committing an act of violence.
This idea that the First Amendment has been weaponized into a threat against democracy and minorities, I think that has gained a lot of currency. I also see it among quite a few sort of First Amendment scholars that they've sort of said, oh, well, maybe we've gone too far. European democracies are the adults in the room. I think that's a catastrophic miscalculation when you see what's happening in Europe. This week, I think, a 9-month pregnant woman in the UK of South Asian origin will be on trial for basically hate speech because she went to a demonstration with a placard of then Prime Minister and Home Ministers who were both of South Asian origin, calling them coconuts. Since it's the UK, it took an almost Monty Python-like development where protesters at her first trial had these placards that said, had coconuts and said, police, this is satire. And these people were also arrested and their coconuts confiscated. This is what's going on in Europe, and you see pro-Palestinian protests being banned in Germany, Israeli Jews, being detained by police. So I don't think that's a direction you want to head down in the U.S. To be sure. But I think it explains why we're at this inflection point. And I think the fact that social media has allowed a lot of people whose voices were not being heard previously has contributed to this, elite panic where the traditional gatekeepers in the media, in academia, among politicians who used to sort of have, be the ones who were able to frame the debates that we had, were able to more or less have a say about what were acceptable opinions and sort of act as gatekeepers for others. They're sort of feeling, well, our position is being undermined, and now, the unwashed mob is having a say, and society will collapse.
Jacob, thank you so much for taking the time to flesh all of this out.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for tuning into today's edition of Undercurrents. A reminder, we are a daily news show. We are here on YouTube and every podcast platform Monday through Friday. So please be sure to subscribe here to the Undercurrents channel. It helps us so much. Subscribe wherever you download your podcasts. Likes, comments, reviews, those things are all incredibly helpful. Undercurrents.tv is where you go to sign up for a premium membership. You get all kinds of good stuff with that. So make sure to subscribe over there. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you on Monday here at Undercurrents.